Hi guys, welcome to our next lecture in the series on biomolecules. Today we're going to talk about lipids. Of course, lipids are commonly known as fats, oils, and waxes. Not much difference between fats and oils except their phase and at room temperature. Waxes I don't know much about, but they're still lipids. If you want to get to become a trillionaire, you don't have to invent the next iPhone. You probably just figure out a way for people to regulate fatty metabolism. That's right, trillionaire with capital T. And in America today, we're facing a couple pandemics. One that's developed in 2019, COVID, but a second one that's been a couple of decades, maybe even a generation in the making, and that's the epidemic of obesity here in the United States. Right now, currently, 50% of Americans are overweight, and 30% are considered obese. And those numbers increase every day. But what's more important is that that pathology is affecting people that are younger and younger. And of course, it has to do with our diet and probably having to do with some changes that have happened culturally as well. But if you could figure out how to manage obesity, you could, make a big impact on pathophysiology, because in addition to just the obvious downside of being overweight and obese, it contributes to the major killers of Americans: cardiovascular disease, diabetes. If you're overweight, you're probably going to have skeletal problems. The list goes on and on. Anyway, lipids, pound for pound, the highest energy storage molecule there is. When I look at the steak, I think about people that cut the fat off their steak, and I just think, like, can I have your fat? That's right. I like eating the fat on the steak. And, part of that comes from what my grandmother told me. As you get older, you're going to have to cook. And guess where all the flavors are? They're in the fats. In fact, the fatty molecules and the sense of taste is intimately associated with the sense of smell. And in fact, those odorific molecules, called aromatic molecules, are a class of hydrocarbons, a class of organic molecules, literally called the aromatic compounds. All right, and so we smell by sniffing fats up our nose, and we taste by having those fats in our nose and in our mouth. And you can see here, the steak has fat on it, and that fat is solid at room temperature. And in general, animal fat is solid at room temperature, and that has to do with this concept of being saturated or unsaturated. On the other hand, you can see to the right, there's a mixing oil with water. And of course, oil is a liquid fat. And, right off the bat, I want you to think about it. Where does oil come from? I mean, oil you can eat, right? Where does the oil you can eat come from? And the answer is plants, all right? So a simple way to think about fats is, do they come from animals or do they come from plants? And we'll talk about where those plant oils come from and how the mass food production facilities and corporate farming like Archer's Daniels Midland has influenced what we eat in processed foods and how they kind of like make cheap fats. Anyway, fats are used for energy storage. Every cell membrane is made up of a fat called a phospholipid. We often refer to that cell membrane as a fluid mosaic model. Here you can see the fluid mosaic. Of course, it's made up of phospholipids with proteins embedded. Plants make oils, and then last but not least, we have Daffy Duck doing a striptease over here. And that's because animals, like ducks, have wax on the feather that retards water from penetrating. And so you have wax as well. We'll learn about that in our next unit. You have specialized sweat glands in your ears that make wax, and that wax helps keep your ears air or watertight. Anyway, let's take a look at the chemical structure of lipids. One of the basic components of every lipid is a hydrocarbon chain with a carboxyl group on the end. So this is the carboxyl group, C double bond O, OH, C double bond O, OH, the carboxyl group or carboxylic acid attached to a hydrocarbon chain. And these are examples here of a saturated fatty acid and an unsaturated fatty acid. Sorry about my internet address. Now you can see here down here in the unsaturated fatty acid, there's a carbon-carbon double bond. And that makes that chain kinky. It puts a bend in that chain. The saturated fatty acids don't have any bends. In fact, all these carbons can rotate it around one another with what's called unlimited rotational freedom. This kink doesn't let them rotate. And so I get kinky chains versus chains that can spin around and lie flat. Which one of these two do you think is liquid at room temperature? And remember, liquids generally are less dense than solids. So which one of these guys will allow them to be, or require them to be less dense? Okay, well, if you guessed this guy is going to be less dense because it'll be unable to stack nice and neatly, you're right. These unsaturated fats are liquid at room temperature. The saturated fats are solid at room temperature. So guess which ones animals make, saturated or unsaturated? That's right. Animals have saturated fats, they're solid at room temperature. Plants make unsaturated fats, they're liquid at room temperature. We call them oils. All right. Well, back when I was a kid, I lived in Oklahoma. They didn't have tasty cakes out there. But when we came home, the tasty cakes were just so good. It was unbelievable. They're still pretty good. I'll go through a box like in a couple hours. But they're not as good. And the reason has to do with the fats they use to make the cakes, but even more importantly, the icing on the cakes. And what they've done is they've gone from using animal fats, lard, right, to plant fats, all right? So anyway, what's easier to get? Oil from a plant or the fat off the back of a pig or or a cow or a horse? I don't know what kind of animal fat, say chicken fat, I don't know what they use. Of course, the answer is oil from a plant's easier to use, right? Plants don't run away from you, and plants are easy to manage. So, Archer Daniels Midland and the other corporations that control farming across the United States realized we can make all this soybean oil, and it'd be great if we could use it. In fact, they started putting it into animal feed. Guess what it does to cows? Fattens them up. It's because it's full of compounds called phytoestrogens. They're hormone mimics, estrogen mimics that make you gain weight. All right, so you'd put soybean into cattle feed, and it would fatten up the cows. But still, we had all this oil around, and they thought, like, well, can't we do something so we can use this in processed food? Because that's what we ultimately like to do, sell this for people. Of course, the answer is hydrogenation. Hydrogenation, right? The problem with these oils is that they have this carbon-carbon double bond. Those strands they're not saturated. They're not fully saturated. When we talk about saturation, we mean that every carbon has as many carbons, as many hydrogens as possible on that chain. Well, this guy, every carbon's saturated with hydrogen. Here, these two are not. So what do I do to make oil into a solid at room temperature? And the answer is you get a big vat of oil, and you simply pump hydrogen through it, and it eliminates these carbon-carbon double bonds. And then you get partially hydrogenated soybean oil. And then you can make icing that doesn't melt at room temperature there with that plant oil. Of course, on the downside, it's full of these phytoestrogens, which mimic our normal estrogens. Anyway, fats have three main functions: storing energy. Imagine I can cut this bond and then that bond and then that bond and then that bond and release energy every time. So it's full of energy. Remember that the cell membrane is made up of phospholipids, and then we also use these molecules as communication molecules. Hormones. I've already mentioned estrogen, right? It's made up of fats. So remember, when we talk about biochemistry, we're talking about polymer chemistry, and lipids are polymers of fatty acids. So know this zigzaggedy chain, that's why I had you guys draw on that zigzag, is a common motif. and at the end it's got a carboxylic acid. This is a fatty acid, which is what you're going to draw on your paper in the activity. So the basic lipid that we have in our bodies are called triacylglyceraldehydes, okay? And in triacylglyceraldehyde, I have the molecule called glycerol that gets attached to 3 fatty acids, all right? 3 fatty acids. They get together through a process called dehydration synthesis. The fatty acid with C double bond OH comes to the glycerol molecule. An OH is given up here, an H is given up here. I lose a water, dehydration synthesis, also known as a condensation reaction, and I do that 3 times to make triacylglyceraldehyde, all right? Condensation reaction. So notice I've got saturated fatty acids here combined with unsaturated fatty acids here, and there you go. So triacylglyceride's got two saturated fatty acids and an unsaturated fatty acid, and it's really the building block for all the fats in your body. But when we talk about fat, that yellow stuff that lies underneath your skin, that is triacylglyceraldehydes. You have special cells there called adipocytes, and they concentrate this compound there. But it gets used to make stuff like the phospholipids. So remember, every cell membrane in your body is made up of phospholipids, all right? And in the phospholipid, we have this phosphate head. Look, here's the glycerol molecule. It's attached to a phosphate, and then I only have 2 hydrocarbon chains here, all right? And hopefully, when you took biology last year, you learned about how these guys line up with their polar heads facing out to the watery environment outside the cell, their polar heads facing into the watery environment inside a cell, and in the middle, this layer of phospholipid hydrocarbon tails that are nonpolar. And they exclude the movement of water. They exclude the water movement of any large molecules. They exclude the movement of any polar molecules. In fact, they only allow small nonpolar molecules like gases, right? So oxygen and CO2 can just simply diffuse across this membrane. Everybody else will need help. You can undergo facilitated diffusion, you can have active transport, but that all arises from this ability of the membrane to be what's called selectively permeable. It's permeable to small nonpolar molecules like oxygen and carbon dioxide. Right? Every cell membrane made of phospholipids. We're almost done. Another important lipid to consider is cholesterol. If you see this STERO, we're talking about a steroid, we're talking about fats. So cholesterol is really important. I need to move fats around the body all the time. So triacylglycerides are actually used to, or combined to form cholesterol, which is this big chain of carbons, all right? And, you know, it's easy to identify. There's 3 hexagons and a pentagon, and then it's got this chain of hydrocarbons out here. And this is the basis for hormones like testosterone or estrogen. Okay, see how they come from cholesterol? And cholesterol is really important. It's an important constituent of cell membranes. Okay, so if you have cardiovascular disease, one of your concerns is your cholesterol levels. And cholesterol is actually carried around the body by proteins that carry fats. We call them lipoproteins. And you have 3 major fractions of lipoproteins: HDL, LDL, and VLDL, that correspond to high-density lipoprotein, low-density lipoprotein, and VLDL, or very low-density lipoproteins. The high-density lipoproteins are the good stuff, and you want to have a high HDL to LDL, VLDL fraction. And so, you know, if you can ask your parents, you know, I think something like 50% of Americans are on statin drugs, and static means to stay. Statin drugs are all about trying to keep down your blood cholesterol levels. Some people tolerate this stuff well. Other people have problems with it. Of course, your brain's made of fat. If you have high circulating cholesterol levels, it can become embedded in the cell membranes of the endothelial tissue that lines your arteries. It can also aggregate on the surfaces of that endothelial layer and become calcified or form plaques. And of course, that's the basis for arterial sclerosis or arteriosclerotic disease, which is the basis for all cardiovascular pathology. Anyway, there you go. See you on the other side.